The last of US forces left Afghanistan, ending a 20-year presence. This has been the longest US war seen, and it saw the death of over 300,000 people, including over 6,000 American soldiers and contractors. The final flight left Kabul airport a day earlier than projected. The Taliban, who fought the US, declared victory and are in full control of the Kabul airport. To discuss the complete withdrawal from Afghanistan, we have with us Matthew Hoh. Matthew is a senior fellow at the Center of International Policy. He's a former Marine in Iraq and is a State Department, or was a State Department official in Afghanistan. Thank you so much for being here, Mr. Hoh.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to first start off with your own personal feelings as you watched that final plane leave the Kabul airport.
Well, it's the feelings I have are simply anger and sadness. There's no celebration, even though myself and many others have been working for a long time to see this moment. Many people who are watching this program have been waiting for this moment for a long time, for the U.S. military occupation to end. There's no celebration. There's only feelings of sadness and anger. For myself, regret for having taken part in these wars. There's anger at what has occurred, what is continuing, what may come, sadness along those same lines. As well as frustration that so much of the United States right now, the focus is on the end of the war, as if August 30th, 2021 was the end of problems for the people of Afghanistan. It's the same type of problem you have when you say the war in Afghanistan starts on September 11th, 2001. It's incomplete and it's inaccurate. And I think there's frustration I have on that because the people of Afghanistan are in dire circumstances. They are already, before the Taliban takeover, they're the second most food insecure people in the world. More than 90% are below the poverty line. 70% live on less than $1 a day. It's a very desperate situation in Afghanistan. The war may not be over because there are still warlords who oppose the Taliban. So the situation for Afghans is a very difficult one, and none of us have crystal balls and can tell what will happen in the future. So there's also this great anxiety as well about what may come to pass.
Let's talk a little bit about the real cost of this war. There's been hundreds and thousands of lives that have been lost. But what have been other costs of this war?
Well, thank you for bringing it up because it's something that gets said in passing in American media. And oftentimes the numbers are inaccurate or baselines are very conservative. You'll hear quite recently that 170,000 Afghans have been killed in this war, and that's simply not true. Many times that I believe the estimates of the last 20 years of deaths in Afghanistan, along with Pakistan, because the two wars are so closely integrated in many ways. The reporting on deaths from credible sources, not from guys like me, but from universities, from medical journals like The Lancet, from journalists who have done a lot of research, is that you're looking at about probably between 1 million and 2 million dead over the last 20 years in Afghanistan and Pakistan. All told, in the U.S. wars in the Muslim world, you're looking anywhere from 3 to 6 million killed in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, all throughout Africa, Somalia, Libya, etc. So the consequences of this war have been catastrophic, and the suffering can't be quantified. The vast amounts of suffering, continues as Afghans have been subjected. At first, they were subjected under the Taliban to a theocratic, repressive government, and these last 20 years, they have been subjected to a predatory, kleptocratic government that is also repressive. And what will come with this new Taliban rule is still to be seen. It is unknown. So I think it's very difficult to talk about the costs, particularly for those of us here in the United States that are so far removed from it. We do know in terms of U.S. costs, in terms of U.S. casualties, that I will say the entire number because it's so difficult to separate the Iraq War from the Afghan War. Number of U.S. service members who were killed directly in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are more than 7,000. More than 8,000 contractors were killed in these wars. It's important to include the contractors because in any previous wars, these were men and women who would be wearing military uniforms, as well as we know that more than 10,000 combat veterans have been killed by suicide since coming home as a direct result of the war. So you're looking at total U.S. deaths in these wars at approximately, or at least 25,000. As well as too the invisible wounds of these wars. More than 500,000 American veterans have traumatic brain injury as a result of these wars. That demonstrates the amount of violence that these wars, the amount of violence that was occurring in these wars. I mean, 500,000 men and women have come back home from the United States, had these traumatic brain injuries. Majority of those traumatic brain injuries have been caused by explosive blasts because in these wars, because of body armor and vehicle armor, American soldiers were able to survive, basically walk away from explosions that in any previous war would have killed or maimed them. So we have hundreds of thousands of men and women who are suffering with traumatic brain injury. And if you go back to the Afghans, the Iraqis, the Syrians, et cetera, remember, those people didn't have body armor or vehicle armor. So the same must be said for the Iraqis, the Afghans, the Syrians, the Yemenis, that the cost is simply unquantifiable. In terms of dollar cost, it is trillions of dollars. Again, it's very hard to separate the Iraq War from the Afghan War. You can say that the the Afghan War direct costs were $2.2 trillion, but that leaves out a lot. I mean, we know that just 5 American contractors, 5 American defense corporations received $2 trillion in the last 20 years alone. So there has been an explosion. People have profited greatly from these wars. The looting of the American treasury that occurred because of these wars is just simply astronomical. Even the amount of money that was spent on the Afghan reconstruction efforts, the $150 billion or so that was spent by the United States to supposedly rebuild Afghanistan, which of course was a colossal failure. That $150 billion, we know from the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, who was congressionally appointed, that of that $150 billion, approximately 80% of that money never left the United States or returned to the United States. So there were plenty of people who profited, plenty of institutions and corporations that got powerful, saw their budgets expand, earned profits, et cetera. So that is one thing I think we can quantify is how wealthy certain individuals and corporations became because of these wars.
Definitely. And I can tell you one cost that is often not either it's not quantifiable, but is often not noted, is the global Islamophobia that spread around the world because of these 2 wars post 9/11. How many Muslim children bullied in schools, how many hijabs pulled off. I mean, this is something that often does not get even tallied. And how many other countries have used this war on terror, Burma, China, India, and are persecuting their minorities. So, but as we go on, who do we hold accountable for this war? Has there, and you've worked for the State Department, is there any accountability inside the State Department? The experts who wrote the white papers on Afghanistan and Pakistan, where is the accountability?
There is no accountability. There's none. The only people who have been held accountable have been people who have spoken out against this war, who've tried to tell the truth of these wars. John Kiriakou, who went to prison for confirming the American torture program. The only person who was ever punished for the American torture program was John Kiriakou, the man who spoke out about it and exposed it. Daniel Hale, who is currently in prison now, a young man who took part in the drone program and regrets and is ashamed of his participation in that drone program and trying to repent for his participation in it, leaked a trove of documents detailing what the United States drone program actually looked like, including the fact that the United States government knows that 90% of the people its drones kills are not intended targets, which means that they are civilians, they are innocent. These are the men who are, these people are punished. Daniel Hale's in prison now because he told the world the truth about these wars, about these drones. Say the same for Chelsea Manning, the same for Julian Assange, et cetera, et cetera. And meanwhile, there is no accountability. And it's just not that these people in the government got this wrong, in the media got this wrong, the think tanks that are funded by the weapons companies and the fossil fuel companies and by foreign governments, not just that they got this wrong and continually got this wrong, but they lied about it. This was a concentrated, systemic lying that occurred all throughout these wars to not only justify the wars, but not to the creation of these wars, the beginning of these wars, but to justify their sustainment and their continuity. So it's not only the fact that they got these wars wrong, but that they purposefully and willfully lied as part of a process to hide the wars, to hide the reality of the wars, and to cover up for the war's immorality and the shame that should actually befall the United States for these wars. So it's deeper than even holding accountable for being wrong. It's trying to hold people accountable for lying.
I also wanted to ask you, as you're watching this, what has the US left behind in terms of arms and weapons? Um, I know majority of the personnel have been pulled out, and there are some Americans, they said, that didn't make it to the airport in time for the cutoff date. What else has been left behind?
Gosh, the United States left behind so much in terms of military equipment that had been provided to the Afghan army and the Afghan police. You're talking about all kinds of vehicles, all kinds of weapons, not just small arms, but heavier weapons, helicopters. And this, of course, is now in the possession of the Taliban. Some of those items were made to be inoperable, such as some of the aircraft, but some were not. So the United States materially left behind quite a lot. But the United States often also left behind many of its allies. There are tens of thousands of Afghans who worked with the United States, who the United States made promises to that they would take care of, that they would assist, that they would not leave behind. And that's exactly what the United States has done. And that's not a consequence of the Joe Biden administration in these last few months. This issue with Afghan allies goes back to the Barack Obama administration. As early as 2013, veterans groups and human rights groups were saying, you have to do something about the people that are working for us in Afghanistan. And the United States government as a whole, Democrats and Republicans, Congress, the executive branch, the military, et cetera, simply failed out because they did not want to do anything to help these people. It's just that simple. If you have a process where people worked with us, our military, where you have military officers, you have development officers, you have diplomats who would attest that, yes, these people worked with us, these people would have given our lives for us, but then they have to go through an 850-day-long process to get a visa, and hardly any of them are approved. That is just a question of will, and it shows the real intentions of the United States in Afghanistan was never to help the Afghan people. This was about expanding and maintaining the American empire and addressing, political opportunism for both Democratic and Republican presidents.
It's hard to talk about this war in many, many aspects. Especially as a Muslim woman, and especially to see how Afghan women and Muslim women are treated like a trophy, right? To be won through these wars, this savior complex. And we're seeing it again. We're seeing this narrative again. Are you seeing it, and how do you respond to that?
Yes. And my question is, where were these people who were concerned about the Afghan women over the last 20 years? Like, there's no question the Taliban are brutal in their misogyny, in that what is befalling Afghanistan is a tragedy. But the last 20 years have been a tragedy as well. the United States took out of brought into power the same warlords and drug lords that the Taliban disposed of. These were men that were brutal, criminal. They were war criminals as well as common criminals, but they were also incredibly misogynist. The human rights violation of the Afghan government over the last 20 years is absolutely legionary. The Afghan government, the Afghan government's misogyny may not have been as theatrical as the Taliban. They were not executing women in stadiums or stoning them in public, but they were still allowing forced marriages. They were still allowing men to rape their wives. They were still imprisoning women who were raped, rather than imprisoning the rapist. The misogyny was there, as well as a multitude of other human rights violations. The sexual abuse of children and the trafficking of children within the Afghan military and government, within these warlord circles, was not a rare occurrence. It's well documented that this was a common occurrence, that this was a systemic issue, this raping and trafficking of children. And U.S. military officers who tried to do something about it were actually punished by the U.S. military for trying to stop that child trafficking and child rape. In terms of other issues, between 1/3 and half of all Afghan government prisoners were tortured. So yes, the Taliban were awful. I am heartbroken for the Afghan people that this is the situation, the circumstances they are in, that basically they are back to where they were 20 years ago in many ways. Maybe not, we'll see. I don't have a crystal ball. However, the fact that the idea that somehow the last 20 years was a period of progress and human rights and just a golden era in Afghanistan is completely false. And so the thing I asked to those who are speaking out for women now is, have you been speaking out for women for the last 20 years? Because many of them have not. Many of them have simply ignored the situation because it was convenient. This has to do with a lot of corruption within our own human rights organizations, because a lot of our own human rights organizations are not independent. They take money from the American government. They take money from European governments. They take money from American corporations that have interests in these wars. So you see many, even human rights organizations, that were afraid to criticize the Afghan government for its own human rights abuses, because that would conflict with the American narrative. And because if you conflict with that narrative, maybe you're afraid that your funding from the American government or American corporations will run dry. So I think there is a lot of blame to go around for the fact that the honest reporting, thorough reporting, holding the Afghan government accountable these last 20 years, there's a lot of blame to go around for why that was not done.
Final question, what's next? I recently saw a tweet about an American, I don't know the name of the plane, but it was a gigantic looking plane. And it's been seen in Pakistan, and questions on Twitter whether a new base was being formed in Pakistan to fight ISIS Khorasan in Afghanistan through Pakistan, or what is next? What's next for relations between U.S. and the Taliban, and what's next for Afghanistan and Pakistan?
Well, unfortunately, unless Joe Biden strikes a path of moral courage that I don't expect him to, the relations between the United States and Afghanistan will be totally dependent upon American public opinion and what is being said on the various cable media channels, et cetera. Joe Biden has taken a tremendous political beating for the Afghan war these last few months. He was entirely right to do what he did. But the problem now is that he appears weak, and will he now try and appear tough in future dealings with with Afghanistan, and in particular Taliban? Afghanistan is in a desperate situation, as said earlier. You're talking about a country that has no economy. The only industry is the narcotics trade. People, millions, the vast majority of people live subsistently. Afghanistan's federal budget, government budget, is sustained for the most part by outside aid. So Afghanistan and the Taliban need money to keep coming in. And if they do not receive that, if it is cut off or continues to remain cut off, the economic situation, which is already an economic collapse, basically, will only get worse. So there are two paths. One, there can be this cruel and bitter peace where the Taliban have won this phase of the war, and that brings a cessation of violence. There has been reporting that the Taliban are in communication with the warlords they are fighting in an attempt to negotiate some type of deal. And I hope that comes through, because as cruel and as unjust that is, at least it will stop the violence or diminish the violence greatly. And if you have a break in that cycle of violence, then you can have the opportunity to rebuild and reconcile. If you continue with this war, it will only look as it has the last 40 plus years in Afghanistan, with a few people profiting, a few people gaining from this war, and the vast majority of Afghans suffering. To your point about the possibility of the United States building a base in Pakistan, and absolutely, the American CIA has a long history with these warlords that are still fighting the Taliban. I can guarantee you that there are people in Washington, D.C. right now who are saying, look, the map of Afghanistan doesn't look much different than it did on September 11th, 2001. We were successful in taking the Taliban out of power back then. We can do it again, and in the great spirit, right, of American hubris, arrogance, and ignorance, we can do it better this time. So that is the danger the Afghan people face. Aside from this economic collapse, aside from being isolated from the world, aside from having no infrastructure, industry whatsoever, there's the very real danger that the Americans may decide through their CIA to continue the war via these warlords, which of course will just allow the last 40 years to continue new phases of violence and slaughter and destitution to occur. And we have to understand this, and I believe we were referencing this earlier, and certainly you were in your comments, in terms of that. Look, this war is one part of the larger American global war on terror, as it's called. I prefer to call it the United States war in the Muslim world, because it stretches from West Africa all the way to Pakistan. And what you see, the way this war is conducted throughout, literally at least 15 countries, probably more. The United States uses secret forces. It uses CIA. It uses special operations. It uses drones. It uses contractors, because contractors are not accountable like the American government is. Contractors can do whatever they want, and no one can kind of provide oversight on them. And then finally, they use proxy. The United States uses proxy forces in Afghanistan. Throughout this war, these wars, these proxy forces, which are government forces and which are militias, and they are the ones who do the bleeding. They are the ones who do the bulk of the killing. And as long as it's not Americans being killed in these wars, the U.S. public doesn't notice, the Congress doesn't really care, and the American media doesn't publicize it, because as long as it's black people killing black people, brown people killing brown people, it doesn't matter to the majority of the United States. And it falls into that narrative, right? That really insipid, disgusting, obscene narrative that these people have been killing themselves, have been killing each other forever, which of course is completely untrue, and allows for the washing of hands of American responsibility and culpability in all these wars, many of them instigated by the United States, or if not instigated, certainly sustained by the United States.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Matthew. It was great talking to you, and hopefully we can have you back someday.
Thank you so much.
We're going to take a quick break before our next analysis segment, so stay tuned.